welcome back to the TLDR News UK podcast. I'm Jack Kelly and I'm joined by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
How are you both doing?
Yeah, very
Great.
well. Yeah.
Good. In today's episode, we're going to be running through some of the biggest underreported stories from around the world today. We're also going to be talking about Rishi Sunak's latest developments in the emergency Rwanda bill, as well as the implications for him and his government. And then at the end of the episode, we're going to be updating the world leader leaderboard, which, if you haven't seen an episode of the podcast before, we'll explain at the end. But first, let's talk about our underreported stories, and let's start with your one, Ben.
Yeah, so mine comes from the UK this week, but I think it's a really important one. So last week, Rishi Sunak actually lost his first vote in the House of Commons, and it's on an issue that has sort of been going on in the background for a little while. So this is the contaminated blood scandal. So this was something that actually happened in the 70s and 80s. So there was the NHS gave out certain blood products to people, and unfortunately, a lot of them were given out to people with haemophilia, and a lot of these products were infected with things like HIV and hepatitis as well, hepatitis C. The government needs to, it was done by the NHS, so the government needs to give out compensation for this, but it's not exactly been agreed on yet how much, etc. There was a vote last week on the Victims and Crime Bill, I think it was, and there was a certain number of backbenchers that pushed for an amendment to this bill. This amendment would set up a scheme to give compensation to the victims, and the government lost. It was, as I say, the first. It's not only the first one that Sunak's lost, it's the first lost government vote since the 2019 general election. So what that means now is that the government has about 3 months to set up this compensation scheme. Now, the government's argument was that we need to wait until the inquiry has done its findings and everything, then we'll set up a scheme. There's some interim payments before that, but they were saying we should just hold off. But campaigners have been really pushing for compensation to be paid because it's estimated that one person who's affected by the scandal dies every 4 days. So they see it as really important that this compensation gets to the victims as soon as possible. So it was largely Tory backbenchers that voted for this amendment, and now means that the government has to set up this scheme. So it's quite a big thing that the government lost this. It's quite a big thing that the government pushed for the compensation to sort of be withheld until the inquiry's done its findings in total. But it's seen by backbenchers and campaigners that speed is really of the utmost importance, considering how many people are affected, and because it was in the 70s and 80s, people are dying as this is going ahead. So yeah, first one the government had lost. It's quite a tricky situation for them, but yeah, it seems like backbenchers seem to think that it's really important that this gets done quicker.
Interesting. Zach, what's your underreported story?
So mine's pretty miserable as well, unfortunately. I'm about the most recent COP communique. So there's obviously COP28 going on in the UAE at the moment. And the most recent communique, and it had, at the time of recording, so we're recording this on Monday afternoon, it hasn't been verified by all of the participating states, but the latest readout has basically ditched most of the language about fully phasing out fossil fuels and oil and gas, and is instead talking about reducing consumption and production in what they describe as a fair and equitable manner. And that is euphemistic talk for basically saying that we are going to continue using fossil fuels basically forever. Right? There's no strict deadline. And I think that this is interesting because it's quite abrupt. Only a year ago, there was a lot of optimistic chat at the last COP about how we were all making really good progress on the energy transition, look at all the investment, and basically we're finally taking this seriously. I don't really know precisely what's changed, but the change in tone is really quite notable. And I think it's a bit of slightly depressing sign that it was very easy to make targets for future politicians back in the sort of 2010s and maybe even the 2000s. But as those targets near and we get to what we might describe as the business end of the energy transition, politicians are quickly sort of turning their nose up at them. And I think I think the US is the most acute example of this at the moment because this is something that's gone entirely underreported as well. But the US today is the world's largest crude oil producer, and more than Saudi Arabia and Russia. That's I think the first time. It depends if you include shale, but really for the first time since the late 20th century. And that's pretty amazing. And that's just because, basically the Saudis and the Russians have been cutting production to try and push up prices. And the Americans responded by increasing production to try and keep the price nice and low. And that just goes to show that even in what should be a front runner in the energy transition, the Americans really should be. They're just one of the wealthiest countries in the world. They can afford it. At the end of the day, sort of economic concerns and geopolitics just do trump climate concerns. And it's just quite depressing. I think that the change in tone from this COP compared to the last one it's really, really conspicuous. And it's not underreported. I mean, everyone's like talking about it, but given that it is like, I think it's fair to say the most important policy issue like facing the world, it's worth noting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we continue and before we get to the UK's latest Rwanda policy and what it means for Rishi Sunak, I just wanted to quickly shout out our newspaper, Too Long, which if you didn't know is the full-length newspaper that we've made over the last few months and is available right now. It's 32 pages long, features a ton of articles written by the TLDR team and some of our favourite creators. And if you'd like a copy and if you'd like to support the channel, then you can head over to our website, tldrnews.co.uk, to pick up a copy. And if you do so now and you live in the UK, it may well get to you before Christmas. Thanks for your support. Let's get to the meat of the podcast and let's talk about the Rwanda bill, specifically the emergency Rwanda bill, which was announced at the end of last week. Ben, do you want to run through a brief rundown of what that is and what's contained in the bill, just for people who may not have seen this morning's video on the topic?
Yeah, so very, very briefly, it's a way for Sunak to try and get around some of the High Court and Supreme Court rulings about his Rwanda policies. This was a policy that was established last year in Boris Johnson's government by the then Home Secretary Priti Patel. The idea is that people who are seeking asylum in the UK, they've made it to the UK, they're putting in an asylum claim, will be sent to Rwanda to have their claim processed there. Now, if they are seen to be a true asylum seeker and are then determined to be a refugee, they'll remain in Rwanda. If not, they'll be sent back to their country of origin. This went through a couple of sort of reviews by multiple different courts, so High Court, Court of Appeal, and then Supreme Court. And it was found that Rwanda didn't have they didn't have a robust enough judicial system to accurately determine who isn't an asylum seeker. So the fear was that someone who is a legitimate refugee could be sent back to their country of origin, where they could face persecution, which breaks something known as the non-refoulement law, which is part of the UN. It's a rule by the UN Refugee Convention. And it basically says that you can't send an asylum seeker back to a country where they can face persecution. So the way that Sunak wanted to get around this, he had sort of 2 points to this. First, he wanted to come up with a treaty with Rwanda, which he did. And the idea is that he set up a couple of different things to try and make the judicial system a little bit more robust, so it has some sort of like oversight by the UK effectively. So that has now been signed. It needs to be approved by Parliament within 21 days. And he also, the second part of that is, what we're discussing now, it's the emergency Rwanda bill. Now, it was the Supreme Court that said that Rwanda isn't safe as a result of the things that I've just sort of discussed. So what this this emergency bill does is put into law that the courts cannot refer to Rwanda as an unsafe country. So it has to be referred to as safe.
Okay.
Now, this has obviously been criticised by, some on the left and even some within the Conservative Party by basically saying that courts have determined as fact that Rwanda is not safe, and the government's solution to that is basically passing a law that says it is not actually by making it safe or anything like that, just by stating you have to refer to it from now on as safe. It's also quite interesting that within the bill, it's got a couple of things in that just seem to be performative.
Okay.
So there's a little line in there that says that Parliament is sovereign. Which you can kind of understand if you're doing like a press release or something like that.
Sure.
But for it to actually be written in legislation like that, like we know this has been established for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Why is that a line within? It's just to be performative.
I didn't know that. That's incredible.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
We're now using legislation as like culture war vehicles.
Yeah, it's remarkable. So yeah, that's in there as well. So tomorrow is the second reading of this bill, and today there's been today while we're recording, so this is Monday, there's been a whole load of different groups within the Conservative Party that have been making their announcements as to how they're going to vote on this bill, which is a bit of a concern for Sunak because, if he loses that, he's centred this on it, his whole premiership will be defined by this. It's one of his key priorities for government, and he's got people to the left of him and to the right of him both considering whether they're going to vote against it. So there's a real risk that he could lose this vote, and if he does, then he has some serious problems. Are you looking at me?
I'm looking generally.
Yeah, I can continue. I think it's worth... So I think what's interesting about this is I think I can understand... I mean, obviously you can understand why the left of the Tory Parliamentary Party doesn't want to vote for this. They just think it's sort of at least superficially inconsistent with the UK's international obligations.
Yeah.
It's ambiguous about how it interacts with the relationship between the judiciary and parliament. And obviously it's just like, it's not their vibes. They're generally quite pro-immigration, or at least less immigration skeptic than, let's just say, like Sunak and the cabinet at the moment. But what I do feel bad for Sunak in that he's also getting flack from the right of the party. So the right of the party basically are just saying that it's not going far enough, and that ideally, I think Ben will probably know more about this than I do, but they want to include those notwithstanding clauses, and some of them also want to leave the ECHR, which is actually the sort of like the main body of international law that binds the UK and like prevents the UK from committing these Rwanda schemes, because the UN Convention on Migration is a convention. Like it's not actually that's legally binding, but we are legally signed up to the ECHR, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's enforced by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So, for example, when the Rwanda flight was stopped at the last minute, that was the ECHR that did it. And so they've said we should just leave it. And just for context, it's worth mentioning the only other European countries that are outside the ECHR are Belarus and Russia. So it doesn't put us in great company. But what I feel bad for Sunak is that even if you buy those arguments, and Sunak said, like, he understands his arguments. The Rwandan government said they would ditch the treaty if basically the UK went ahead with either notwithstanding clauses or left the ECHR, because the Rwandan government is terrible optics for them. They don't want to be seen. I mean, this ties into Paul Kagame, who's the leader of Rwanda, his like wider policy of sort of trying to modernize Rwanda and bring it into like we might describe as like the Western international community. I think that maybe too much, but like he's basically trying to change. He's trying to do some good PR for Rwanda, and this obviously isn't good PR to be sort of seen to facilitating violations of international law, or at least like withdrawals from uncontroversial human rights treaties.
So it's not just the notwithstanding clauses that the right are annoyed about either. The thing that they're saying is that the bill specifically focuses on this like Rwanda is safe line. So the ERG made a statement at midday on Monday, which is the day that we're recording, and Marc Francois, who heads it, basically said that he's concerned that asylum seekers will launch legal challenges not, on things outside of whether Rwanda is safe. So that is focusing so specifically on that clause that they'll launch what he sees as spurious legal challenges to try and block deportations. Based on other problematic elements.
They've also that ties on to another thing they complain about, which is that it still leaves open the possibility for individual appeals. So
that's
asylum seekers could make appeals, and the right of the Conservative Party worries that will mean that this new policy isn't sufficiently deterring other asylum seekers, and it's just too legally ambiguous. But I think that's sort of beside the point. The point is that sure, Sunak could have gone further in loads of ways that would have made the right of the Tory party happier. But Rwanda said we're not going to go ahead with this. So it's redundant. Like he couldn't have actually gone further. Otherwise, the treaty would have collapsed, and he wouldn't have a third country to deport people to. But the fact, even though those are the facts on the ground, he's still getting flack from the right of the Tory party. And I mean, he should just be able to say to them, look, guys, I understand, but this wouldn't work because the whole thing would fall apart. And that somehow just doesn't pass muster. So I do feel a bit bad for him. I mean, it does feel quite Brexity in that respect.
Why do you think that is? Like, these are arguably smart people. Like, they presumably understand that, like, he's doing the most he could do. What they're actually asking for isn't feasible anyway. They know that this is a kind of a performative, pointless argument. So I think why are they doing it?
I think there's three things here. So the first, I think, is that he got very unlucky in that the immediate reaction to this bill from not even just right-wing Tories, like big Tories, but like even Robert Jenrick, who was his former immigration minister, who resigned, the immediate reaction was very critical.
Sure.
And I think that's actually, Robert Jenrick probably resigned for personal reasons. He probably because he's positioning for a better job when Sunak has to resign. I mean, that's cynical, but I think that's maybe it's unfair, and but he was previously a moderate Tory, or at least relatively moderate. And he was called Robert Generic because he just didn't have like actual policy positions.
It's a great slight, isn't it?
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
And the fact that he's resigned over what is quite a hawkish immigration policy, saying it's not sufficiently right-wing, it just doesn't really, it's not consistent with his previous politics, you see what I mean? So I think it's sort of fair to conclude that he at least had an eye on keeping, on his like future political aspirations. And he's probably hoping that when Sunak goes and most likely outcome is a more right-wing leader takes over, this will burnish his right-wing credentials in immigration and maybe get him a job in the next cabinet. And then Suella Braverman, who's constantly positioning for the upcoming leadership election, she was also quite critical of it straight out the blocks. And I think that just set the tone for quite a lot of like right-wing Tory MPs, and they just sort of followed suit. The other thing I think about it is that I think some of them just doubt that Sunak is being even though the Rwandans have confirmed it, they sort of just doubt that that's true. They sort of think like, oh, if you pushed them harder, yeah, sure, you could have got a better deal. And the third thing, I do think this is true of quite a lot of the immigration debate, is it's a symptom of like a wider cakeism. Like it's this sort of like, we can have our cake and eat it. We can just do this. Like we just need to try hard enough. And it is a bit reminiscent of the Brexit era when certain politicians weren't, if they're not blind to the political realities, they at least sort of like were conveniently ignore them. And I think that plays into it a little bit. I do just think when it comes to immigration policy, it's become so difficult and so sort of like charged that people are very unwilling to show flex, even if that's just sort of what those are just a reflection of the realities on the ground. Do you see what I mean?
I think there's also an element of just, I know that you sort of touched on this in your first of those three reasons, but I think there's just an element of positioning, and posturing. Sunak's not doing well in the polls. This is something that has become sort of almost like a wedge issue within the Conservative Party, between the moderates and those on the right wing. And I think that there are certain people who want to try and show that they really are, they're really strong on migration and all this. So by undermining the Prime Minister, saying that he's not going far enough, when he loses the next election, you can then point to him and say, well, he should have gone further, and I was actually saying that he should have gone further, and that's why I should be in the top job or in cabinet or whatever.
Sure.
So I think there is just, this has become so charged. And the other thing to just bear in mind with all of this is that the Conservative Party have been saying for years that they want to bring the number of the sort of migration rate down to the tens of thousands. And what we're talking about here is asylum, people who are seeking asylum and small boats and all that kind of thing, which accounts for such a small percentage of the migration figures. This isn't going to be the thing that brings the migration rate down to the tens of thousands. This has become I still think that this is such a charged thing. This has become such a thing driven by posturing. So I think a lot of it is motivated by that.
I think that's true, of course, that they've been saying the tens of thousands things for ages.
Since Cameron, at least.
Yeah, 2010, I think, is when it was first mentioned. But I do think that, like, sure, they're not going to get it down by reducing asylum claims, because you're right, asylum claims make up like less than 10% of like aggregate immigration into the UK. But the asylum thing is a separate and relevant political problem for the Tories. So I don't think it's like politically not sensible for them to be trying to fix that.
No, but I think that my point is that I think so much of it is driven by posturing. Like if you really are committed to solving, you want to bring the immigration rate down, you've got to look at students and you've got to look at things like the Ukraine and Hong Kong students.
To be fair to them, the couple of days before the Rwanda policy, they did also introduce a whole load of measures that basically like increase the salary threshold to bring in, like, this is for regular immigration, not asylum seekers.
But how much focus is being paid on this versus that? That's what I'm saying. If you really are focused on bringing the migration rate down, the argument would be about the measures that they introduced last week and whether they went far enough.
They're two separate problems, aren't they? Like they're trying to do both things, and the asylum thing is a real problem for them, and this is why they're focusing on it. I also think that actually, I know that the tens of thousands thing is the most frequent bit of rhetoric, but I do think that actually the political problem for them is with asylum seekers. Like that's the thing that Farage was focused on before he went off to the jungle. That's the thing they're worried about reform running on really in the future. And it's the thing that actually the public are most worried about. Like the public, if you poll them on like, oh, do you think we should have less students or less Ukrainians or less Hong Kong like asylum seekers? I don't know what it's British nationals overseas. Then they say no. But if you ask them, like, do you think the asylum system is broken? They say yes, basically. So I think this is the amount of focus paid to this is in some sense a reflection of the public's political priorities.
Obviously, we're having this conversation on Monday before the vote happens. We've got talk here of people on the left of the Tory party objecting for one set of reasons, people on the right objecting for an entirely different set of reasons. What do we think the vague numbers are going to be here? You're saying there's a chance he could lose. How real is that chance, and how big could that loss be?
So within the Conservative Party, obviously, and we mention this in quite a lot of the UK videos we put out these days, it's obviously very factional. So you have 6 different right-wing Tory factions that are all basing their judgment on how to vote on the ruling by the ERG. So the ERG came out on today as we're recording at about midday. and headed by Marc Francois. And there was this whole thing about a group of lawyers, something like the Star Chamber.
Yeah.
So they were going to make this decision on what they thought. And obviously we referred to this earlier, and they basically said, we don't think it's gone far enough. So that was the ruling. So there are now 6 Conservative groups. That's the ERG, the New Conservatives, the Common Sense Group, the Northern Research Group, and the Conservative Growth Group. So 5 of them that are all... a lot of them have said that they're going to make their decision about how to vote tomorrow at 6 p.m. today. So we don't know how they're going to vote yet.
Yeah.
But the actual judgment by the lawyers in the ERG was that we don't think it goes far enough. So we can expect them to at least push back a bit. Whether they're going to go as far as to not vote for it, that's a separate question.
Yeah.
Francois hinted today that he thinks that the vote should be pulled, but he hasn't actually said that he's going to try and instruct the ERG to vote against it. So we don't really know about that yet. The centrists are mainly represented by the One Nation Caucus, which is led by Damien Green. They said that they'll make the decision again at 6 p.m. today, so we don't know how they're going to vote. Ultimately, only 29 MPs, Tory MPs, need to vote against the bill for it to fail, or 57 to abstain. The ERG comprises about 100.
When you say that, it reminds you quite how many MPs they've just lost.
Yeah.
Since the Boris Johnson. What was the majority when Boris Johnson came in?
It was 59 or something, wasn't it?
With that, I think that's how many people had to abstain. Have you just picked 57?
No, 57. So I think it was about 59.
They've just ticked off quite a few, haven't they?
Yeah.
There's been quite a few by-elections. Yeah, things are just a lot tighter than I remember them being.
Yeah. So 29 to vote against, 57 to abstain. The opposition is all expected to vote against.
Of course.
So the question really is whether they're going to abstain or vote against. How many we're going to see? I think that there'll be quite a few abstentions. I think it'll be narrow, but I think the government will just win. Is my thought. I think that the main groups tonight will suggest that they're going to vote in favour. And one other quick thing just to bear in mind as well is that this is only the second reading. So there is some discussion at the minute that those on the right are going to try and seek an agreement with Sunak that they'll vote in favour of it at this point.
Yeah.
If Sunak is open to scheduling amendments, in the committee stage in early next year. And I think that is likely what's going to happen.
Okay.
So I think that they're going to come to some agreement where they vote in favour on the understanding that they can maybe get some amendments in at the beginning of next year. Because if he loses this vote tomorrow, then, things are really going to look bad for him and his premiership.
And what would that look like? Obviously, you mentioned in your underreported story the first government loss since 2019. This would be the second.
Yeah.
More significant, considering the last one was underreported.
Yeah.
What does that look like for his premiership, his government, the prospects of another election, etc.?
Well, talk and possibly letters of no confidence will be, that will really kick that into gear, I think. Because he staked so much of his premiership on this, because it's one of his 5 main things, because he's, this is like the 3rd or 4th bit of legislation going through related to small boats and asylum and all that. And it's seen that each one that comes through is because the previous one had failed.
Yeah.
It just adds pressure to him. And I think that technically speaking, I think what we'll see is a lot of talk about voting no confidence, a lot of talk that the Prime Minister can't get important business through, a lot of talk that he's failing on one of his key elements, and possibly actual letters being sent in. Whether we hit that threshold, we don't even know if he loses the vote tomorrow. So,
sure.
Speculating on how many letters might be sent in is incredibly difficult. But I think it's very possible that we'll get quite a lot of letters sent in. And, if they hit that threshold, I don't know exactly what the threshold is, 55 letters, I think, then, it'll be a vote of no confidence in him. I feel fairly confident. I know that there's so many things for that to happen, but I feel fairly confident that even if we were to get there, he'd win.
Okay.
But, very, very undermined.
What are your thoughts on this, Zach? Both the prospects of loss and what that would mean, but also the fact we're even having this conversation at this stage in Sunak's premiership.
I do actually just feel it. I mean, this is not a popular opinion, but I do actually just feel a bit bad for him.
Sure.
It's such chaos.
I
know what I mean? I don't know. I feel like this is, this one, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, there's nothing else he could have done. This is as far as, if you take his word for it, this is as far as Rwanda was going to go.
Yeah.
And so, what else do the right wing, the Tory party want? I think Ben's probably right. I think that's the base case, that it will probably pass by a narrow margin. And then I think if there was a leadership challenge, I think he'd win. So I think he'll stay in power. I expect him to fight the next election, whenever that happens. But I do think that the Tory party is now just stuck in this doom loop, which we've talked about in the past. But it's, when you've got this degree of factionalism, you just can't run an effective electoral machine. It just doesn't work. And so you end up with this horrible doom loop where the factionalism makes the polling worse, and the bad polling just encourages further factionalism because people are just positioning for the upcoming leadership contest they know is inevitable, and that just makes the polling worse, which makes the factionalism worse, which makes the polling worse ad infinitum. And they do just seem to be stuck in this doom loop. I also think that there's something deeply unwise about Sunak's decision to make immigration the central plank of his premiership. When he first came in, it was all about economic competence. And I still think that would have been a better bet for him because I think you see how much difficulty Labour have trying to differentiate themselves from the Tories on sort of fiscal policy. The Tories' fiscal policy is deeply unpopular. It's a lot of taxes and sort of crumbling public services. But at the same time, there are sort of fiscal constraints that mean that there aren't that many alternatives available to them. I mean, there are stuff you could do, but they're politically quite risky. And you see that reflected in the fact that Labour basically just say, we'll do the exact same thing as the Tories, even though the Tories' fiscal plans aren't great.
I sort of agree that is the takeaway, is that it is almost ridiculous that he's pivoted his premiership towards this, away from economic competence. But I actually think that after what happens tomorrow, and I think that it will be certain abstentions or votes against, that his takeaway will be that he needs to go further right to appease those on the right. So I think that he'll, if tomorrow happens as we're expecting, that there are abstentions votes against, that the thing that the change that we'll see is that he's going to move further right to try and appease those on the right.
Sure.
I think that's...
I agree with that descriptively. I think that's very true. I think that is the base case. You're right, is that he's going to face more political turmoil and he'll react by tilting even further right.
Because that's what he's done so far. But
again, I think that's deeply politically unwise.
Yeah.
I think what he basically he's confusing two things. One is the fact that immigration and asylum is very high up the public's political priorities. And he's seen that polling and he's clearly gone, as have lots of governments, okay, we need to talk tough game on immigration and that sort of thing. And that works very well if you're in opposition. And again, you see this across Europe. There's a lot of new European governments come in basically because they promised to get tough on immigration. But it doesn't work when you're in government because, and again, this is in some part related to the fact that immigration is such a high on the sort of policy agenda at the moment. Immigration is just really difficult to solve. It's not just us that's struggling to solve this issue in inverted commas. I don't want to imply that it's a bad thing or it needs a solution necessarily. But immigration, insofar as the public perceives it, immigration is a difficult thing to solve, or at least insofar as the Conservative voting base perceives it, because they do want low immigration. But it's just a really difficult issue to solve. And so I think what you should have really done is looked across Europe and seen that even those right-wing governments that come in promising to fix immigration, Giorgia Meloni is a very good example of this, for example, when they actually get into government, they really struggle to do it because it's a really complicated problem, not just legally. We have all these international human rights obligations via the ECHR, for example, but it's also economically in that various parts of our economy, especially parts of the public sector, just do rely on immigration. And the public's attitude to immigration is, and I mentioned this again before, is just quite schizophrenic. They want low immigration, but then you ask them where they want low immigration, and they're just not sure where they want low immigration. And so I think if you are going to try and make immigration your sort of policy plank, you have to be less reactive. You have to actually make an argument to the public, be like, okay, in these places, I know you think you want low immigration, but we need immigrants here, or we're going to pay a massive economic cost. But he's too afraid to make those arguments. He doesn't have the political capital to make them arguments. So he's just trying to follow the polling in a way. Do you see what I mean? And just trying to bring down immigration without due regard for the costs involved.
I just think I completely agree with all that, and I just the only thing I'd add is that if you think he's got limited political capital to make any legitimate arguments on immigration at the minute, wait until what happens after tomorrow. I think that's only going to be diminished, and I think you're only going to see him follow that polling even further into next year and in the next general election. I think that his instinct so far has shown that when he's challenged, he will try and appease the right, but substantively, I don't think he has the solutions. I think and this emergency bill shows that. I really just think that next year we will see him move to the right even further without any sort of anything to back that up, any actual substantive policy aims.
Okay, so to end the podcast, as always, we're going to run through our World Leader Leaderboard. If you're new to the show, because we've just moved over to the TLDR UK channel from the TLDR podcast channel, I'm going to briefly explain how this works. Each episode, our guests, this week Zach and Ben, will be moving people around on the World Leader Leaderboard to reflect the current state of play in geopolitics. At the very top of the board, we have the people who are doing best right now. The people at the bottom of the board are the people deemed to be doing the worst. The way that people move is that each week, Zach and Ben choose a winner and loser of the week who will move up or down one place. They're also allowed to add new people to the board if they think there's people who are being underrepresented by our board, and different rules are in place to that will explain if and when that happens. Essentially though, each week they're asked for who their winner and loser in politics this week is, and then those changes will be reflected in the board. One thing to emphasize is that this isn't in any way an endorsement of these people. There's people doing well on the board that we might not like, but that's fine. This isn't a reflection of morality or of
politics.
Our politics.
If
this
it was,
is
it'd
just
be very confusing.
Yeah. This is just how things stand right now. We've been doing this for a few months. There is going to be a link in the description of this episode to the last episode of the podcast we recorded, where we ran through the entire board and justified why everyone was where they were. So if you're confused by any of this, go and watch that episode. You'll find out why people are where they are. If you're not confused, great. Let's move on. Let's start with losers of the week. These are people who are going to be moving down one spot on the board. Zach, who is your loser of the week? And I will move it for you.
My loser of the week, which is very off-brand for me, is Mohammed bin Salman.
MBS.
Yeah, poor MBS. So he's going down sort of for two related reasons. The main reason is that with the rest of OPEC, and actually OPEC Plus, so including Russia, he's been cutting, this is such a me story, but he's been cutting oil production in the hope to boost prices because he just wants basically more money in the long term, wants structurally high oil prices so that he can fund all his crazy projects, you know, like the Saudi Football League and the massive neon line city, all that sort of thing. And he's just been singularly unsuccessful at this. And oil prices are down, something like, they're about $75 a barrel at the moment, which is down from like a couple of months ago and is trading more like 80. But just like fundamentally, that's just quite low compared to what most analysts were expecting, like coming out of the pandemic. And especially post Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That's mainly because the Americans have just started pumping tons of oil. And that is quite...
Biggest oil producer in the world, I've heard.
There you go, that's word on the street. And that's just quite impressive from the Americans. It just goes to show like the sort of strength of the American like economy is, I don't mean like the wider economy, actually that's pretty strong as well, but more just like the sort of pure like commodity power of America, which is just wild. And the other reason is that he's basically been trying to like convince the rest of OPEC to also cut production to try and boost prices. And some of the small members have just had enough because they've been like, well, we keep on cutting and it keeps on going down. Like, I just want money now. And so you've had lots of reports that lots of countries are secretly like producing more than they should because you're part of a cartel. You don't normally say, I'm not going to do it. But then you also had a couple of countries who just said they're not going to do it. So I think Angola, for example, just said like, I've had enough of this. We're just going to produce a whole load more oil. And there've been some questions about whether or not Russia is sticking to its cuts. But yeah, I think those are the two reasons that things aren't going great for MBS. It's got lower oil revenues than he'd like. And the main vehicle for like Saudi geopolitical power, which is OPEC and OPEC Plus, which is sort of what they dominate, is fracturing a little bit. So I think that's why he's going down.
Ben, who's your loser of the week?
Yeah, so my loser is someone who's not currently on the board. So I'll give you this.
A new person.
It's Hamza Youssef, the leader of Scotland, the First Minister.
Okay.
So basically,
sorry, Ben. I know I said explain the rules if this happened.
Yes.
What happens now is that they enter on this row. Losers of the week, new entries enter on this row. Winners of the week enter on this row. So just above the middle or below the middle. So
you're not talking into a microphone.
I know, but I'm loud. Hamza Youssef is going next.
Yeah, so basically he had a meeting with the Turkish president this week, or maybe it was end of last week, and he's been told off by the Foreign Secretary David Cameron. He's threatened him, saying that we'll also need to consider the presence of Scottish government officers in UK government posts. So basically, obviously, Scotland is a devolved nation. They have certain devolved powers, but there are reserved powers. One of the reserved powers is foreign affairs. So it should be all done by the UK Foreign Secretary, currently David Cameron. And they've argued that because Youssef has met with Erdogan, it's broken like protocol effectively.
Okay.
Now there is some technicality in that if it's a reserve power, so something a devolved power, which is something that the Scottish government has competency over, then they are allowed to meet with foreign leaders. But the UK government is basically saying that it's not that. And the point here is that the UK government is using this now to basically kind of threaten the Scottish government a bit. And Youssef isn't doing particularly well at the minute as it is. So things like this really do not help him.
Yeah, first, the other reason that it's bad for Hamza Yusuf, I think, is it suggests that David Cameron, so Nicola Sturgeon did quite a lot of this during her premiership, but it suggests that David Cameron is going to be cracking down on sort of like Scotland having its own foreign policy and Scotland like hanging out with foreign leaders independently of the UK. I think that's bad for Hamza Yusuf because I think he doesn't have political power to basically resist that. And so I do think this will be sort of the end of Scotland having its sort of own stage in the international community. The other reason I think it's bad is because, and I understand why it happened, but of all the foreign leaders to like meet with and sort of like try and forge your own independent foreign policy, Erdogan is probably not the one. Like, he's not that popular in the UK.
Sure.
And I understand why he did it. I mean, Erdogan presumably tried to get Hamza Yusuf because Erdogan is one of the staunchest supporters of Palestine, or staunchest critics of Israel, shall we say. And I think he probably sees Hamza Yusuf as a sort of natural ally in that respect, because Hamza Yusuf, obviously, his in-laws were stuck in Gaza, and he's been one of the more vocal critics of Israel, at least in the West, especially definitely in the UK. But I don't think it's probably the person you necessarily want to associate yourself with immediately when you're sort of making your first forays into independent foreign policy.
It's a fair point.
Yeah.
Your winner of the week, Zach. Who are you moving up the board?
My winner of the week is Xi Jinping.
Whoa.
Yeah, big Xi. So this is mainly because I think maybe the last month or so, Huawei released their new phone, and it took a bit of a time for people to get their hands on it, but basically the latest chip in the Huawei's new phone, I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, it's a month or two old, really outperformed expectations. So the US has been leading this sort of sanctions regime against China when it was microchip development, because they consider them strategically significant technologies, and they're basically worried. They basically want to maintain their sort of like tech hegemony against China. And that's forced China to sort of produce domestically its own chips. And this most recent chip, we don't want to get into technicalities too much, but basically it's only like a year or two behind the most advanced commercially available Western chips. And then a couple of days ago, Huawei announced, and again, this is hard to verify, but they basically announced that they had created a 5 nanometer chip. So this would be like basically the smallest chip around. I think that Intel is currently working on 7 nanometers, or has finished 7 nanometers. And again, that has to all be verified. But the headline story here is that China is just making a lot better progress on its domestic chip development than Western analysts expected, especially than the US expected. And I think this is part of this wider trend, is that we're finding out that actually sanctions are often not that effective. But I think just more accurately, their efficacy really wanes quite quickly over time. So when you put these massive sort of chip sanctions on places like China, it might slow them down for a couple of months, but actually they normally end up catching up. And it's very hard to sanction a country as big as China in a globalized trade system that's interconnected as ours currently is. So I think there's an interesting, obviously it's good news for China, but I also think there's an interesting data point in the wider like sanctions argument. A lot of people are quite optimistic, or at least before, let's just say the last couple of years, were optimistic that sanctions are like a good tool to sort of fight geopolitical battles without running the risk of actual military escalation. And I think that actually we're realizing that sanctions aren't that effective. I mean, you saw something similar with Russia, that the sanctions regime on Russia has been like mixed in its efficacy, let's say. But yeah, so I think that's good for Xi Jinping. I'm not saying he's having a great time. Economic woes still very, very real.
He's still only on the middle of the board.
Yeah, but I think this is pretty good for him.
Yeah. Ben, who's your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is President Lula.
Whoa!
Yeah, so basically, and if you watched the daily briefing yesterday, you'll know all about this, but he's overseen a huge drop in the deforestation rate of the Amazon. So if you haven't...
Where is he?
Yes.
Oh, there. He's just deep in the middle of this section. Sorry, you go there.
Okay. So basically, last year, you can compare like month by month. So November this year, there was a 64% drop from the November previously in the deforestation rate. So he announced this at COP, and he also made clear that he wanted to try and drop the deforestation rate to 0 by 2030. And the fact that it's dropped, it's a 60, accounts for a 64% drop just from year to year is obviously big progress in that. And it's something that he made quite clear, him following on from Bolsonaro, and the deforestation rate obviously went up under him. So it's not only good news for the Amazon rainforest, but also for his own aims coming into office. And it's, a big step towards this, zero deforestation goal by 2030. So, pretty good news for him.
Pretty good news for him.
That's pretty good.
Okay, so that's how the board sits today. We'll be updating the board again in the next episode of the TLDR News podcast, which comes out on Thursday.
But on a different channel.
On the TLDR Global channel.
Yeah.
So if you want to see the next episode where we discuss another topic, and we also talk about underreported stories, and we move around the board, make sure you subscribe to TLDR Global YouTube channel, or you subscribe to TLDR Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And then you'll be updated when it comes out.
Yeah, and we're back here on the same channel doing this one next week.
Tuesday. Yeah. Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
Until we die. We will see you there.
I can't promise that for me.
You haven't seen your contract. Look more carefully. You can move jobs, but you're back here on Tuesdays. We'll see you then. We'll see you next Tuesday on the TLDR UK channel, next Thursday on the TLDR Global channel, and between then, all over the YouTube. All over YouTube.
All over the YouTube.
YouTube.